Hi, friends. Welcome back to the Astrology Hub podcast. Right now, you may feel like life has you in two places at once. Part of you still connected to what's familiar, and the other part of you noticing that there's a future that wants to emerge. And that threshold space is exactly where the astrology of March 2026 meets us. My name's Laura. I'm an astrologer, head of operations here at Astrology Hub, and your host for today's show. In this episode, I sat down with Levine to talk about the astrology of March 2026. The transits this month describe that threshold moment that we're in. It's a time where the past may not feel fully complete, but the future is already asking for our participation. And that tension can feel confusing, emotional, and even disorienting. In this episode, Levine breaks down why this feeling is so present right now and why the astrology of March is a call to action. So without further ado, let's dive in. All right, Rick, welcome back to the Astrology Hub podcast. It's so great to have you back for another monthly forecast.
Yeah, nice to be back. It's always a fun thing to do this time with you.
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about the astrology of March 2026. But before we go there, we did a forecast on February last time. And so let's start with a little bit of a recap of February, since I know some of those transits kind of take us into the month of March.
Do we have to? Oh my God. February feels like it lasted 2 or 3 years. I mean, just from the amount of flooding of information that we had, much often about things that we don't ever want to know that we ever knew. I mean, it's crazy. The amount of, what was one of the key words that we had? Was it unraveling? Was that the word?
And unraveling, yes. And
I mean, we are well into this process. And if anything, it certainly strengthens our case as astrologers to be able to energetically understand what's going on. If I remember correctly, through January and February, we had planets moving from, at the beginning of the year, from Capricorn into Aquarius, lining up with Pluto. And I talked about how things were going to be coming up from the dark, the underworld, the secrets are going to continue to come out, even though back then it felt like what more could be said. And then as the planets all gathered and moved into Aquarius with the solar eclipse at the end of last month of February in Aquarius, it was almost like these are like last waves of energy, because as we begin March, we now have most of the planets on into Pisces. And yet the real key players behind all of this are the 4 heavyweights in Aries at the beginning of March. And that would be the conjunction of Saturn and Neptune, which we can look back at now and say, oh, that was last week or last month, depending upon when you're looking at it, because that was exact on February 20. But of course, even on March 1st, the Saturn to Neptune spread is still less than 1 degree. And all through much of February, if we saw a birth chart with a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in it that were 45 minutes of arc, that's 3/4 of a degree, we would go, wow, that's a really close conjunction of 2 heavy powermonger planets. They were heavyweights. And on March 1st, that Saturn to Neptune is 45 minutes of arc. It's 3/4 of a degree. So even though it's in the past, this is going to impact and affect us a lot. And looking back at February, what we began to see is how Neptune, the rose-colored glasses, were coming off, and we were being revealed the reality of what Saturn is sitting behind it. And the ramifications are still just unfolding. There's a lot more to come out of this. And when I say this, I don't only mean the sex or the Jeffrey Epstein thing, but the hidden money. I mean, there's so many nuances of political stuff that we've been entrenched with, not for just the presidency of Donald Trump, but the presidency of presidents going back to the beginnings of the country, maybe even back to traditions of Rome or Babylon, where some of this stuff has come from. It's very, very opening and revealing. And I've been saying, and I'm going to get again, that what we're going through this year in 2026 is not like anything that we've ever seen in history, at least in recorded history. And when it seems like there's a lot going on, There is. And so we move into March with as I was saying, four heavyweights, the Saturn and Neptune, both at 1 degree of Aries now. And we also still have Chiron and Eris, which a lot of people gloss over, but this is a conjunction that happens about every 53 years or something like that. And when Chiron, which is a 50-year cycle, catches up to Eris, Chiron is about exposing and feeling the wounds and teaching what we've learned from experiencing those wounds, not always physical. Matter of fact, not necessarily physical, because on some level, as we know, there's no difference between the physical and the metaphysical. But as Chiron catches up to Eris, who kind of has like her brother Mars, she gets a bit of a bad rap because she's known as the sower of discord, or or the creator of chaos. Now Mars did that, but basically to defend boundaries or to assert or aggress into other boundaries. That's not what Eris is all about. Eris likes to stir up trouble and chaos so that she can see what's not fitting in and where the issues are, so that on a higher level, it can be integrated in. And so we have Chiron joining up with Eris, which is basically something that's been unfolding all through 2025 and 2026, and will continue to at the end of Aries. So in March, at the beginning of March, we have just those four heavyweights in Aries. But as we unfold the month, Venus is the first of the faster moving planets, and Venus moves into Aries on March 6th. And then, because Mercury is retrograde, Mercury is going to take a bit longer. The sun moves into Aries on the first day of spring. That would be on March 20th. And then Mercury turns direct, and Mercury and Mars both will move into Aries in April, so that the new moon in Aries, I know we're talking about March, but I need to frame this because where we're heading toward is a new moon in Aries where Mercury, Mars, Sun, Moon, Neptune, Eris, and Chiron. We have 7 planets, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I missed one. Mercury, and Mars, all in Aries. And that's kind of where this is going, still in preparation for what will unfold in the summer. So let's come back to March 1st, where on the 1st of March, we still have some planets lingering in Pisces. And remember, the larger shift of what we're going through is the Saturn and Neptune having both spent time in Pisces and moving into Aries. And so as we get the planets moving through Pisces and toward Aries, we're going to feel the action heating up day by day and week by week. And again, the intensity is strong. And for those people who are already saying, I've had enough, I don't know how to tell you this. You haven't. There's more coming. And it's not all negative. It's just that what we're seeing is the last flailings of something that is coming to an end. Now, whether it comes to an end gracefully, this is not about what happens week by week and even month by month this year, because the shift that we're looking at going through is a shift that's going to take decades, if not really centuries, to fully unfold. It's like the last time there was a Saturn-Neptune conjunction at 0 Aries was about 6,000 years ago in 5th century BC. And although it doesn't look like anything was recorded that year, this is a pivotal time where we went from tribal animals to city dwellers to agriculture to use of metals. I mean, the shifts that were going on then were huge. And the shifts that are going on now with respect to technology, with consciousness, with so many things are just as huge. So, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to clarify. So the decades and centuries to unfold what you're talking about that's from the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, the effects of that conjunction, or the effects of like everything.
The effects of everything, whether it's the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, whether it's the Uranus-Pluto trine, which has been tickling us for a year or so, but will be exact for the first time this summer for 3 years on and off, whether we're talking about the United States of America's Pluto return, which is a 250-year cycle, or 248-year cycle, whether we're talking about the shift of Pluto from Capricorn into Aquarius, or even the age of Aquarius, even though that may not officially, whatever that means, start for another 100 years. All these changes are coming together. And when they're combined with the speed at which technology and consciousness is changing, it makes everything a very different story. That's really the point. It's not any one thing.
Hi, friends. If you are loving this conversation, I would love to extend an invitation to you to Mark's upcoming live Saturn Cycles webinar happening here at Astrology Hub on Tuesday, March 3rd. Mark is going to guide you step by step on how to calculate your Saturn cycles, how to identify which phase you're in right now, and what each threshold is inviting you into. He'll also walk you through real chart examples so you can see how Saturn weaves story across an entire lifetime, not just at the Saturn return. This webinar is an opportunity to start consciously working with these important chapters in your life and identify exactly what they mean for you. We will also be hosting a live Q&A as part of this webinar series, so you can have the opportunity to ask your questions and dive even deeper into Mark's teachings. And even if you can't make it live, we will be releasing replays of these sessions, and you will have lifetime access to the recordings. To learn more, head to astrologyhub.com/Saturn cycles. We're also going to drop that link in the show notes. I can't wait to see you there. And now back to the episode.
But when we look at March, there are some very interesting, very one things. And then we start the month off right away on March 2nd with Mars moving into Pisces. And again, when a planet's in Pisces, even though it's coming from Aquarius to into Pisces, the Pisces is going to quickly become the anchor of what's holding us back to the age of Pisces, back to the illusions, back to the fake newses of not only the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, but with Saturn and Neptune in Pisces now for 14 years, now having moved into Aries. So Mars moving into Pisces on the very beginning of the month on March 2nd, almost is like a signal that even though everything's moving forward really quickly, we got an anchor here in Pisces that's still going to be stirring up illusions and mysteries and uncertainties. And of course, Pisces is also about compassion and, human connection. So I don't want to dwell on just the negative part of this. But as Mars moves into Pisces, it also makes a square and a half with Jupiter. Now, Jupiter is retrograde in Cancer, but Jupiter turns direct on March 10th. And remember, Jupiter is often considered the cosmic good guy. In traditional astrology, his title was the Greater Benefic. I like cosmic good guy. The problem is that even Hippocrates wrote that what he wrote was every tonic in excess is toxic. So it doesn't matter how good something is, too much of it will still kill you. And Jupiter, although it has the reputation of being good because it makes things seem better and bigger and more, and all of that's cool, but Jupiter is a powerhouse. And as Mars moving into Pisces on March 2nd and making an exact sesqui-square with Jupiter, sesqui-square is a square and a half, and it functions like a square. It creates tension that needs resolution. But here the tension is between Mars, forceful, going into Pisces. Where am I going? I don't know, but I got to look like I'm going somewhere. And to Jupiter saying, make it bigger, make it more. We've had, and we're still coming off of some trines to Jupiter that I'll talk about in a bit. One of them is Mercury having trined Jupiter once, and because it's turned retrograde, Mercury trine Jupiter around the 16th of February, and Mercury in its retrograde will trine Jupiter again on March 6th, March 5th. We're coming right up to it right now. And then when it turns direct, it'll trine Jupiter again for the third and final time, the beginning of April, on April 3rd. Why is this significant? Because when Mercury trines Jupiter, it's like big ideas come out so much that they may be overwhelming. And I talked to someone the other day and said, this person who's a news junkie said, I can't take any more. My brain is full. And this is Mercury trining Jupiter. And the reason why we're talking about this, not just because it's coming up, but because at the beginning of March, Mars is trining Jupiter. And this might end up being an overexpansive show of military power because it's Mars. It may be not just a shouting match because Mercury still is involved in all of this, but there's just that stuff of Jupiter going more, more, more. And because Jupiter isn't moving right now, what do I mean it isn't moving? Well, because it's at the end of its retrograde phase on March 1st, Jupiter is at 15.25 degrees of Cancer, still moving backward. But on March 10th, Jupiter is still at 15 degrees of Cancer, and then it starts moving forward, and it doesn't leave that 15 degrees and 15.25 degrees of Cancer until almost the end of March, but it's still at 15 degrees of Cancer even at the beginning of April. When a planet doesn't move or isn't moving, just like when Mercury changes directions, that's where it holds power. And so we have these planets coming into these connections with Jupiter that are quite significant. The first being Mars's sesquisquare with Jupiter on March 2nd, coming into the eclipse. This is a part of the eclipse. We'll come back and talk about that in a moment. That's on March 3rd in the morning on the west coast of the US at 3:37 a.m. But we start the month with Mars and Jupiter making that aspect. By March 5th, we have the sun making its trine to Jupiter. Okay, turn the faucets off. We're flooding. This is like a biblical flood, but it's not just water, although it has been that in some places and snow in some places. It's a flood of images. It's a flood of imagination. It's a flood of news. It's a flood of data, almost like in the Matrix where you see those green letters trickling down the screen as the Matrix breaks up. And it feels like that's March 5th. But then on March 8th, Mercury retrograding makes its second trine to Jupiter. Remember, its first trine was on February 16th, and its third will be on April 3rd. So that caps a whole period of time where we're stuck in this flow of information that just can't seem to be turned off. That's March 8th. But then as the sun continues to move along on its path, and just right as the sun moves into Aries, which is the first moment of spring on March 20th, on March 21st, Mars makes its trine to Jupiter. And so we have this repetitive theme that's on March 21st, Mars trining Jupiter, again in a sporting match. That's a great aspect because you have the enthusiasm of Jupiter coupled with the force of Aries. But this is all a bit overwhelming. And this is part of what March is all about. But I think it's also obviously not only important, but crucial that we spend a moment talking about the second of the two eclipses this season. The first was February 17th, that we had the new moon eclipse. And then on March 3rd, we have the full moon eclipse conjunct the south node, denoting past facts that we need to let go of, things that are no longer useful on some level. But this eclipse coming up, this full moon in full moon eclipse moon in Virgo, is not only opposing the sun in Pisces, but also Mars in Pisces, Mercury in Pisces, and Venus in Pisces. And so we have this whole dilemma of useful facts saying yes, no, what's good, what's not good, what should we keep, what should we throw away, how do we discriminate what's real from what's not real? That's what the moon in Virgo wants us to do. But all those planets in Pisces want us to accept the field of information and just see and embrace the whole thing altogether. And so it can be a bit overwhelming, especially because Mars, just prior to the eclipse, prior to the full moon, Mars moves into dispersive Pisces and makes that square and a half with overwhelmingly expansive Jupiter. So this is incredibly potent because it's in some way a metaphor for holding on to what we had, but I don't think it will last because Mercury then will make on March 4th a half square to Pluto. And Mercury's half square to Pluto, again, because when Mercury turns retrograde, it goes over a planetary aspect, and then it goes back over it again, and then over it again for a third and final time, like we talked about with the Mercury-Jupiter 3 times. Well, Mercury also does the same thing in its half square to Pluto, and it made its first half square to Pluto back on February 20th, right at the same time within a day of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. So all this information is being revealed that's uncomfortable. This is the Mercury data, Pluto coming up from the underworld. That was on February 19th. And then on March 4th, it'll make that aspect a second time, and then a third time on April 7th. But what this means is that we can expect more overwhelming amounts of more information that's coming up, exposing things that we might have thought, we might have heard, we might have dismissed as a conspiracy, but now it's coming up in ways that it's like, holy crap, this stuff is all real. And of course, on March 4th, also, we have Venus making a sextile with Uranus. And so it's an uncontrollable few days. I don't think this is necessarily negative. I think this is just a lot of stuff going on, a lot more stuff coming out. On March 6th, Venus moves into Aries, and now we're getting a sense of where are we going with all of this going forward. In fact, Mercury makes a cazimi it lines up exactly with the sun on March 7th. Communication is really potent now. And yet, remember, Venus moved into Aries on March 6th. Well, what's it going to do when it gets into Aries? First thing it's going to do is it's going to say, hello, Neptune, hello, Saturn, because they're both at the first degree of Aries. And so we have Venus lining up with Neptune on the 7th and Saturn on the 8th. The dream Neptune all of a sudden hits the wall, becomes real again, the 8th. And as part of that same thing, Mercury makes its trine with Jupiter, overwhelmingly too much information. I mean, there's just so much stuff going on, and Jupiter is stationing because it turns direct. And I say it turns direct, that's the mathematical calculation. It really doesn't move pretty much all month for all practical purposes, but Jupiter turns direct on March 10th, which kind of says that the solar system's energy of growth, which has been pulling back, going into a latent phase, just like when a kid grows, there's weeks and months where it looks like nothing happens. And then one day your kid wakes up and he's 2 or 3 inches taller and talking differently. I mean, growth happens like that. And that's Jupiter going into its latent phase when it's retrograde and through March, and the exact date is March 10th. But I wouldn't necessarily put too much weight on that date itself. It's just the beginning of the process where the force, the energy, the expansion, the growth of the entire solar system is now being fueled again and will be for the next, 7-8 months ahead. Then we have a little bit of a breather space here. And I say breather, it's not like it's not like a go to sleep breather, but there isn't that kind of action for a bit. And then around 12th, 13th, around the 13th, Mars still moving through Pisces. Yeah, I sometimes feel like Mars in Pisces is like, do you ever have one of those nights when you're all dressed up and ready to go to a party you've been looking forward to, and you realize you can't find the goddamn invitation and you don't know where it is, and there's no one to call to find out where it is. And Mars in Pisces sometimes is all dressed up and ready to go, and it doesn't know where to go. And so on March 8th, Mars going through Pisces, which will do for the entire month of March. But Mars going through Pisces on March 13th is what we're at 8 degrees of Pisces. That's where the 8 came in. Mars will line up with the north node of the moon. This is the eclipse point. The nodal axes define relationship between the sun and the moon's orbit. And so on March 13th, Mars hits that nodal point. And yet there's something else that we talked about last month. I don't know if I talked about it in depth. I did in my YouTube monthly, but that is that Chiron and Eris are both making half squares and square and a halves to both sides of the nodal axis. And they've been holding that for a bit. And on March 13th, 14th, 15th, Mars moves through those points where it lines up with the nodes and makes half squares with Chiron and Eris. I'll come back to that in a moment. But then on March 15th, 16th, even the 17th, retrograde Mercury does the exact same things. And in fact, that whole magic of that Mercury and Mars doing that at the same time gives force and energy to what it is that we say in a way that's tied to some sort of vortex time loop or something, because it's involving the nodal axis and it's semi-square to Chiron and Eris. And here's the thing about semi-squares. Most astrologers know all about squares. Their engagement, their conflict, you got to make a decision because things are going in two different ways. Squares are often disruptive. Well, half squares are not less active than squares, but they're more focused, which means that in a half square, we're often motivated to do something about it. We can go through a square and think about what we should do. We can come up with a plan and yet do nothing during that process. During these half squares, what are we going to be motivated to do? We're going to be motivated to Mercury speak with compassion in Pisces, and Mars to engage in some way wherever we can, even if we don't know what the long-term process is, in a way that's half square to Chiron and Eris, which is about healing ancient wounds and stirring up enough trouble to bring things out into the open so that they can then be brought back into inclusion. So that's the magic. Oh, and during the same period of time, we also have Venus making a half square with Uranus, which is even stirring things up even more because it makes it very exciting. I think that this whole period of time is quite exciting, that by the 18th of Mars, Venus is making a square to Jupiter. And this reminds me of the old Mae West line, I've been rich, I've been poor, rich is better. But she also said too much of a good thing is a good thing, which is not if you're eating stuff bad for you that tastes good, or if you're doing sex, drugs, or alcohol, anything that might be pleasurable in a moment. With a Venus square Jupiter, we're back to the it's too much theme that I had going a bit ago. And then the sun makes a sextile with Uranus during the same time. I see this week as being a really, really big week that leads right into the new moon on March 18th. And I think that's a breather period of time that is quite potent. It is the date of, well, within a day of the third and final Chiron Eris conjunction, which I referenced back at the beginning, because Chiron and Eris came together in the early summer of 2025, and then again in the fall on their retrogrades. And so this is the third and final chance that we have to work with the coalescence of Chiron and Eris. That would be the teacher, the mentor, the learning, the wounds that propagate people to teach or to heal or to help. Remember, Chiron may have been the original mentor. Chiron taught Asclepius the healing arts. Chiron taught Hercules how to fight. So in some ways, we teach based upon our own old wounds. And when Chiron aligns with Eris, it's not afraid to stir up shit that's uncomfortable. And so during this period of time, I think that the perfection of this on March 19th, very, very close to this new moon that we just talked about. And the new moon actually has Mars now coming into its trine with Jupiter. Again, we have this too much, too much, too much. There's just so much energy being tied up. And Mercury, which I mentioned earlier, is actually it's about a degree away from making its exact half squared to the Chiron and Eris that was exact a few days ago that we already talked about. The energy here is intense, and yet this is not an eclipse, but it is the seed period. And it's very important to understand that this seed period is happening at the next to last degree of Pisces, just like the previous new moon was at 28 degrees at the 29th degree of Aquarius. This one is at the 29th degree of Pisces, getting us ready, because in the days immediately following, literally immediately following this eclipse, the moon moves into Aries. The moon moves into Aries at 9:02 p.m., which is really just a few hours. The eclipse is at 6:30. So the eclipse happens a couple of hours later, 3 hours later, the moon moves into Aries, and that's on the 19th. Then on the 20th, the sun moves into Aries. And so it's almost like this Pisces eclipse is like a goodbye. And I think here we're now talking about what's really going on in March, because by March 20th, we have the sun, Neptune, Saturn, Venus, the moon, Chiron, and Eris. That's 7 planets all in Aries, with retrograde Mercury just getting ready to turn direct, actually also within a few hours of the sun's move into Aries. So Mercury technically turns direct on March 20th, which is the same day that the sun moves into Aries, one day after Chiron makes its exact conjunction with Eris, and two days after the actual new moon in Pisces. What we're seeing is a adios Pisces, but Mercury is still retrograde in Pisces, just getting ready to turn direct. And Mars is still in Pisces, so we still can't let go of the old, even though we know everything's moving on. There's stuff holding us back. And I keep thinking of Douglas Adams, who wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or the Universe. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe. But the point here is we're leaving the age of Pisces. I mean, it may not be happening for another half a century or more, but in some ways, what March is, maybe this is the theme of March. So long and thanks for the fish. Because there's this whole concept of multiplicity, not Gemini duality, but multiplicity in Pisces. It's the multiplicity of the fish, of Christ making that miracle of everything happening. But in some ways, by the vernal equinox in the northern hemisphere, the autumn equinox if you're south of the equator, by the equinox on March 20th, we're in new ground. We're in new ground. And now we're pushing into this Aries stuff. Saturn is pushing away from its conjunction with Neptune. By March 20th, Saturn is almost 2.5 degrees away from Neptune. They're still close, and it's still confusing, but we're beginning to get inklings of what's going on. And then what happens when the sun moves into Aries? Hello, Neptune. Hello, Saturn. Because they're both pushed a little bit further on, the sun doesn't join up with Neptune until March 22nd. And then the sun joins up with Neptune on March 25th. And then the sun makes a sextile with Pluto, again, dredging stuff up from the underworld. But I think that once we get toward the end of the month, the energy shifted again. But we also have Mercury and Venus. Remember, Mercury was making those half squares with Chiron and Eris as it went over the nodes. That, when was that? Like around the 16th, 15th, 16th, 17th. Well, by the 20th, because Mercury stationed and then Mau's moving direct, it's going back through that same damn point again. And so it's like we can't get beyond the complexity of chironic healing, forgiveness, remedy, and the disruptions and disorganization of Eris. And so what we have on March 26th, 27th, 26th and 27th, both Mercury and Venus are connecting up with the Chiron. In fact, on the 20th, the moon makes a conjunction at late Aries with Eris and Chiron. And then by the 23rd, Venus is lining up with, actually the 25th, 26th, Venus is lining up with Eris and Chiron, almost as we have to forgive. We have to somehow embrace or at least acknowledge. Forgiveness doesn't mean absolving someone, of whatever the consequences are of their actions. But Mercury also in that half square place again, it's like our minds are struggling to try to put all this into place. And then there's two things that happen at the end of the month that cap the month off. I think one of them other astrologers will notice, and one of them might slightly pass under many people's radars. The one that everyone will notice is that Venus becomes the first of the planets to leave Aries and head into Taurus, which is what's going to happen more in April and May as the Sun, Mercury, and Mars do the same. But right now, Venus is pushing ahead of the Sun. So on March 30th, Venus moves into Taurus, which can ground our needs and our desires and just kind of take a little bit of the edge off of we want something new. Maybe now we want something more stable. We want things to be more sensible. We'll see how that plays out. But the other thing that is hugely significant that is pushing toward the latter part of March, and that is a sextile between Saturn and Pluto. I mean, this sextile has been in play. I mean, going back to the March 1st, Saturn and Mars were sextile by under 3 degrees. By the middle of the month, by March 15th, that Saturn-Pluto sextile is down to about 1.5 degrees. Then Saturn makes its exact sextile with Pluto on March 28th. Now, why is this important and why will it go into people's radars? Well, often when we're doing this kind of monthly stuff, sextiles are just they kind of can come and go. They just don't often catch our attention. But to me, sextiles are like trines, except they don't just flow. You have to take the opportunity.
Hi, friends. If you've been enjoying this conversation, the best way to stay connected is to subscribe to our channel, whether you're listening on YouTube or on the podcast player app. We have an incredible lineup of episodes coming your way throughout March. We'll be joined by Colette Barron-Reed discussing the importance of the nervous system when dealing with manifestation. Stefan Burns helping us understand the geophysics behind the powerful times we're living in. Pam Gregory guiding us through the meaning behind the Aries equinox. And Christopher Renstrom breaking down the Saturn-Pluto sextile and what it means for the road ahead. And of course, Rick Levine will be back at the end of the month for the April 2026 forecast. The easiest way to stay connected is to hit subscribe wherever you're listening. It really helps support the channel and ensures you're walking this journey with us in real time. For those of you who are already subscribed, thank you so much. Now, let's get back to the episode.
There's something about the sextile that says you have to put energy into it for something to happen. Well, if we look at the Saturn-Pluto sextile, this is the first chance we have to do something positive, to do something that creates an opportunity or growth from what was going on when we had the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. The Saturn-Pluto conjunction, as many people know, and some people may try to forget, was on January 12th, 2020, the day that the coronavirus genome was announced and the first mortalities were pronounced. And of course, we know what unfolded from that. I've actually begun to call that period of time, that 2020 into 2021, rather than calling it the quarantine or the COVID period. I call that the period of Earth having a stroke or humanity having a stroke. It's like for almost a year, we were just moving around, and then we just stopped. It was like, whether it was enforced or whether we did it, not an issue. I don't know. I don't care. But the image of understanding from an energetic standpoint what happened then, and then there was a bit of a reset. And then from that, as we began coming out of that, just like when a stroke victim comes out of a stroke, there's a relearning and you're not the same as you were going into it. And the fact that we can look back centuries. I actually have you might want to put up the YouTube link on the history of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction opposition cycles, because we're talking about the conjunctions in the 20th century of Saturn and Pluto were 1914, August, within a week of World War I starting. August again of 1947, within a week of India and Pakistan being partitioned and released from the British Commonwealth. Also, the year or within a year, either way, of the formation of the UN and the formation of the State of Israel, put that one aside. And then in 1982, we had the whole fiasco of the bombing of Lebanon by Israel and the whole U.S. embassy in Tehran and all of that went on. Also, it was the only colonial war in the Western Hemisphere in 1982, because that was when Britain and Argentina fought over the Falkland Islands, remnant of colonialism. Even the bombing of the World Trade Tower was on a Saturn-Pluto opposition. That history is fascinating when it comes to the restructuring of boundaries, both physical, nationalistic, and even idea boundaries. The whole Copernican revolution occurred on Saturn-Pluto conjunctions and squares. What does that mean to this month? What it means is that as we push toward the end of this month, as we push through this month, we're given an opportunity to take Saturn's ability to create boundary and Pluto's drive to cause metamorphosis, to change boundaries so that they can better reflect the nature of what is rather than the nature of what was. And so we have this opportunity as Saturn comes into that perfected sextile with Pluto. I think this is also not only a stabilizing factor, but also a signal to what's coming ahead. Because remember, in July, Neptune will make that same exact perfected sextile with Pluto, as it also makes a perfected exact sextile with Uranus on the other side. And this is pulling in that whole complexity of what I'm calling the almost grand sextile of July 19th, when we have Pluto, Neptune, Uranus, Jupiter, and the moon making 5 points on a 6-pointed star. And I think here we're seeing some potential of what may be around the bend. That's it. That's all I know.
Rick, I mean, if you could only see the notes I've been taking, it sounds like a very busy month. And so if February was the unraveling, it sounds like March is kind of, I don't want to be dramatic, but it kind of sounds like a crisis point of some, no?
Well, there's crises and crises and crises. And I'm not saying there won't be any, but I think on some crazy level, we might be through the most local crisis, whatever that is. And I think that there's just a continuation of, like, what's that phrase? Poking the bear. Mm-hmm. It's just like again and again and again from different sides. I think, I mean, I love like having a meal at the restaurant at the edge of the universe, the Douglas Adams things. So long and thanks for the fish. We're moving on to something new, but we still have anchors in the old that's not letting us get away as fast as we might like to, even with all those planets moving into Aries. And remember, the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Aries, Neptune is not proactive. Neptune is absorptive and expansive metaphysically. And when Neptune and Saturn come together in Aries, there is a proactive, progenerative sense to it that as the planets, including the sun at the equinox and the days after, when the sun moves from Pisces into Aries and lines up with Neptune and Saturn, it's going to remind us of that push forward, but we're not going to push forward without getting the resistance of the fish are not giving up. So long and thanks for the fish. There's a lot of fish out there that are saying, you know what? This ocean ain't dry yet, and we're going to do whatever we can to keep it going. I don't think that March is worse than February. I think it's a mixed message, and I never know, and no one really does, which way things will go. Astrologers have prided themselves on their ability to predict, but I think prediction is often based upon the predictor's bias and wish fulfillments and fantasies, whether it's they fear something or want something. All I know, and this is my prediction again and again and again, and that is that if you don't do anything, you'll end up going exactly where you were going.
Yeah. So, Rick, about the fish, when will we be ready to kind of let the old world go? Is it at that Aries new moon in April that you were saying at the beginning that's kind of leading up to that big pileup in Aries? Like, when can we feel like, okay, no, we're totally in this new space and we can let things go?
So when did the age of Pisces start?
Oh, I don't know.
Maybe it was Jesus' birth. Maybe it was the Council of Nicaea. Maybe it was, what's the birth of the United States? There was a Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776, but the Articles of Confederation and the establishment of the government didn't happen until, I think, 1783, if I'm not maybe off a year there. The point is that there is no one point when it's done. Look, even when it's done, in the United States, the Civil War ended 150 years ago. Apparently, it hasn't ended. Are we done with it? And again, I'm just using that as things hold on. We have this idea of disincarnation, death, and reincarnation, as if everything doesn't go through that same process. And as we know, when you leave your body, consciousness doesn't end. And so when something is over physically, there's still remnants and vibrations that hold on. And so I'm very hesitant to say this will be over on such and such a date, because I'm assuming, and maybe this is my faulty assumption, that in 100 years or in 500 years, on some level, some humans, if we're still around, are going to still be having the same battle. Mm. In many ways, you can look at current history and see it as an instant replay with new costumes and languages of that which was going on 2,500 years ago. It's like, have we learned any lessons? Well, no, we're still playing the same dumb old human games. And maybe we will learn some lessons, and maybe that's what this is about. But I think it would be a bit hubristic, is that the right word, for me to just assume that this is it. Pretty much in every era, humanity has thought that the end of the world is near.
Yeah.
We think that because we're all in bodies, and bodies die. And so we all know that we'll live up to the end. But it keeps going on. And yet, having said that, this year, 2026, is presenting us with some absolute unique, never happened before opportunities for instant change. Look, there's never been a time in history where humanity can share so many ideas with so many people so fast that overnight something could happen. It used to take decades, centuries for an idea like the invention of the printing press in China, 200 years before Gutenberg? But they didn't know it. Imagine if one part of the country had iPhones and the other part of the country was still using Morse code. And it continued that way for your entire lifetime. So we live in an incredibly unique moment where consciousness can change on a dime. And it makes prediction futile, and it requires engagement and involvement, because otherwise we'll get to where we were going, which may not be the place where we thought we were going.
Rarely is, right? So to try to recap, what I wrote down for the first week or so is uncontrollable and overwhelming. It sounds like we have a lot of Jupiter being involved with the trines to Mercury and Mars trine to Jupiter and the squares and a half, right, to Jupiter.
Yeah.
Overwhelming. But we still have Mars in Pisces. So there's this ties to the past. We can't quite let go. It's a little bit slower. Maybe our direction is a little bit blurred. And then that lunar eclipse, something you said was the dilemma of what's useful and what's not, or what's real
Yeah,
and what's not.
Virgo to Pisces. The full moon eclipse is in Virgo.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Virgo moon wants to make a decision. This is this and that is that. Remember, in the body, the Virgo part of the body is the bowels, is the intestines. And that's where the body biologically says, let's assimilate this because I can use it. And it passes it into the bloodstream. Nope, this is shit. Let's send it down the line and let Pluto excrete it. I mean, seriously, metaphorically, that's what Virgo is all about. Yes, no, good, not good, useful, not useful. And yet it's happening at a point that's lined up with the south node of the moon, which has to do with the past. And it's opposite all those planets in Pisces, which says, forget about discrimination, accept everything and figure out how to be compassionate and embrace everything.
Okay, great. And so then by the middle of the month, we have a lot of action with Mars in the north node and making aspects to Chiron in Eris, Mercury doing the same thing. And there's a new moon in that period as well. And so it's kind of a final period to work with that Chiron Eris energy. And it's at 29 degrees Pisces. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. I think it's 29 and 28 and a half. Let me just see here. It is, the new moon is at, just 28 and a half degrees of Pisces. So it's almost 29 degrees Pisces.
Right. So the beginning of the month is overwhelming, uncontrollable. We get to the more beginning, the middle of the month, which is this period, which you called a breather period, which that doesn't sound too much of a breather, but from Pisces, that makes sense. And then towards the end of the month, you said that we have a big shift in energy. But is that because all of the planets are moving into Aries and we have less in Pisces? Is that what you meant by that?
Well, I think that, yes, that is part of it. And I think also there's just less pressure, I think, toward the very middle of the month. But by the beginning of spring, once the sun moves into Aries, we're going to want action. And that sun and the moon going over all the Aries planets, at least toward the end of March, or around the 21st, 20th, 1st, 2nd, right in there, up to about the 25th when the sun catches up with Saturn. It's definitely, the energy has shifted. I think we're wanting to figure out, what are we going to do about what it is we now know? And again, we have to be careful about making one-sided predictions, because with Saturn separating from Neptune and the sun lining up with Saturn, there can be military suppression. This isn't all about freedom of speech, so to speak, because obviously pretty much everything cuts two ways. That's part of the Jupiter thing. The way you described it, maybe even the way I described it unintentionally, a lot of Jupiter isn't necessarily bad. And you used the word overwhelming, which is interesting. Do you know that whelming is actually a word?
Is it?
And whelmed, the word whelmed means to be underwater.
Oh.
And so overwhelmed, underwhelmed, whelmed, I mean, it's basically, I think the overwhelmed with all that Piscean energy, there is a sense of being underwater. And, and the flood thing, and this is something that I've been hearing about a lot, been talking about it some, and that is this whole idea of this technique called flooding, which is a conscious technique that governments use, the CIA uses. Apparently lawyers not only know about it, but can be warned against using it, but sometimes can use it to their favor. And what flooding is basically like, imagine a trial where someone just brings in so much information, and some of it is really useful and some of it is not, and some of it's true, but it's just overwhelming. The jury just goes, I can't deal with all this. And there's just a psychological numb out. And so the downside of all this Jupiter stuff is that it's really easy to go home, pull the covers up over our head, and take a cup of tea under the covers and not answer the phone, and just sip our tea and say everything's going to be fine.
Yeah, well, I think that's where a lot of people are at. I mean, it's where I find myself sometimes, which is like, it's just too much to turn on the news. It's just too much. And I have so much going on in my own life that I just try to focus on my four walls, what's in here. But yeah, that's
Yeah, your four walls, your one husband, your two kids,
right.
the
Right.
electric bill, and your parents yelling at you for something. Not
Right. Yeah. Sometimes I don't have the time, and it's just great for my own nervous system to take a step back. And so it sounds like this is a good month to, if you need to take a step back, or at least notice how much time you're spending in the information soup.
I think that's true, but I would caution anyone from taking all the steps back, because
Yes.
that is the game that they, whoever the hell they are, that's what they want us to do. And once we take a lot of steps back, then we lose participation. And if we don't take care of ourselves, then we can't take care of those who are depending on us or those we love. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, Rick, I'll put you on the spot. If you had to give this month like a theme or a word or something that people can take with them as they go through this whelming, what would you say?
It's just another month. Well, in some ways, my old astrology partner in crime, who passed away, geez, just over 10 years ago now, he used to say that the astrologers had legality from the Astrologers Full Employment Act. And when someone would say the Astrologers Full Employment Act, what's that? He'd go, the planets, they keep moving around. They're not going to stop, in March. And yes, I think overwhelming might be, or maybe whelming is the word of the month, but it's whelming with a sense of action. Those planets moving into Aries, it's like we've crossed the threshold. There may be more thresholds, and maybe the threshold is that interliminal, interdimensional, in between Bardo states, as the Tibetans call it, is that place in between, but we've crossed into it. We're no longer where we were. It's what some biologists, including my buddy Bruce Lipton, call imaginal cells. Caterpillar goes into the chrysalis, into the cocoon, into the chrysalis stage, and it melts and it becomes just this black goo. Caterpillar's dead, or something's not there, but the cells start buzzing and sparking and recreating lines between them that recrystallize into a butterfly. And biologists call those imaginal cells. And maybe at this point in time, we've moved into a realm where we're all realizing our potential as imaginal cells, and we get to choose either the light, love, compassion, moving forward, and the truth. And sometimes those actually interfere with each other, or we can choose denial, going backwards into what felt safe and maybe was built on an illusion of what was in the dark and hidden. I don't know if that was a theme, but that's what I thought when you said that. It's definitely the feeling of whelming into action, or there is a move here towards wanting to do something. And maybe in some ways, this is a call to action. It may be, because I think that by midsummer, I think in some ways the die will have been cast. Not that there won't be any room to move, but I think that it's what we're doing now in January, February, March, and April that will determine the solidification of what happens during the Neptune, Uranus, Pluto trines and sextiles.
So it sounds like we'll have a lot to talk about next month as well when we do another forecast for April. And yeah, I'm grateful to have your stewardship during this time, because I think when we look back and we think about the butterfly caterpillar metaphor, it'll make a lot more sense. Be like, oh, of course we were in that. And right now when we're in it, it's really hard to see where we're going. So,
well, there's this old story of these two caterpillars at the base of a milkweed plant. And one caterpillar looking up and seeing a butterfly going by says, man, you'd never get me up in one of those things, because the caterpillar cannot visualize itself as a butterfly. And I think that without going New Age woo-woo, and I think that to some extent, New Age woo-woo is dead. Something new is being birthed, having been someone who came of age during the 60s and certainly lived and breathed that woo-woo. I do think that we are moving into a phase where people will begin to realize that what is imagined now, I come back to one of my favorite William Blake quotes, and that is, what is now proved was once only imagined. And in a way, and I probably said this in last month's talk here, but in some ways, Neptune creates an invisible scaffolding or framework for Saturn to crystallize the three-dimensional world on. And it's going to take years for that crystallization to fully manifest. But the seed is planted, and the seed is what creates the rippling out of that crystallization. And so that is what's happening at the end of, or through February and March, but certainly toward the end of February and all through March is the beginning of the power of that moving into action. And I think we need to pay attention to who we are, what we're doing, how we hold on to integrity, where we're tempted to not say anything because not saying something is always easier than saying something. But what illusion does that feed that then will crystallize into the three-dimensional reality we don't want?
I love that. Think of the illusions that you're feeding by even just not saying anything. That's incredible, Rick. Where can people find you this month? Are you doing anything cool this month that you want people to know about?
Well, yeah, coming up, I have a couple of things. Obviously, I'll be doing NORWAC, which is the Northwest Astrology Conference here in Seattle. And I'll be doing the opening keynote for that and a talk in the conference and a post-conference there. And separate from that, actually, the week before, I'll be in London with Steve Judd, Alex Trenoweth, Penny Thornton, and Darby Costello at a 3-day conference there. And then at the end of the summer is Lilydale and UAC, all of which can be found on my website, which is ricklevineastrologer.com.
Yes, amazing. Well, thank you so much, Rick. This has been incredible. And I'm really looking forward to when we get together next month for April to see where this has all landed and where we are. And if this landed for you, if you're watching this in a place where you can comment, would love to hear how this is going for you. Please leave us a comment. And yeah, Rick, anything else you want to leave us with before we close this up?
Of course, think cosmically, act locally, because if you don't act locally, thinking cosmically is just a waste of energy.
That's right. I love that. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for tuning into this episode, and thank you for making astrology a part of your life. We'll see you on the next episode.